We ended the last episode with the completion of the covering force battle around the city of Chernihiv, as the two advancing columns reached the outskirts of the city and halted after encountering resistance. For this episode, we're going to end the tour of the Chernihiv battlefield and then take a tour of the battles that took place on the eastern side of Kiev. I'll end the episode by addressing what I've learned by examining these various battle spaces for the Battle of Kiev on a tactical level. What the Russians did next was to probe the entrances to the city along every main road on the western side of Chernihiv to determine if there was a route into the city without resistance or with limited resistance. This is that alternate highway route into the city that I'd highlighted as a contrast to the M01 E95 highway. As they came within a few kilometers of the city, a Russian company jockeyed to engage in fire with the Ukrainian armored platoon with something down the road that was in this low ground about 1 kilometer down the road. The Russians were able to push through at this location. However, they then would have discovered that the two bridges for this highway to go across the river on the western side of Chernihiv had been demolished, meaning this was no longer an easy route into the city. A few hundred meters past the demolished bridges, there's a dug-in Ukrainian defensive position with a wrecked armored vehicle in front of it, though I'm not sure if it's Ukrainian or Russian. There is an undestroyed road across the river along this route here, and it appears from this location that the Russians jockeyed to direct fire onto the Ukrainian defensive position. There's another set of tracks where the Russians continued to fire on the Ukrainian defensive position, but there are no Russian tracks on the far side of the forest, indicating that the advance down this route was halted by the Ukrainians. Slightly to the south, there's another encounter between Ukrainian and Russian tanks. There doesn't appear to be any Russian tracks beyond this encounter position, and in any case, the two bridges down this route into the city of Chernihiv were also demolished. Finally, the Russians advanced down this major railway track, as well as in parallel to the P56 highway. The Ukrainians strong-pointed this large building, which overlooked the railway line, but as you can see, it was surrounded and reduced by the Russians. There's signs of a few other ambushes on the way to Chernihiv, although in this area it seems to be mostly infantry rather than armored in terms of the Ukrainians, until you arrive near the intersection of the P56 and the M01 highways. It appears that Russian reconnaissance elements came out of the tree line and were engaged in fire by Ukrainian armored vehicles. They would have observed this significant roadblock and defensive position along the M95 highway, as well as dug in defensive positions in this small forest near the highway interchange. You can also see the tracks where Russian reconnaissance elements made contact with another Ukrainian roadblock on the P56 highway. A Ukrainian documentary about the Battle of Chernihiv claims that a small National Guard unit held this forest, which they'd heavily entrenched under intensive Russian shell fire for several days. Due to the trees, I'm unable to comment on the level of entrenchment, but the amount of shells in this area certainly seems to back up the Ukrainian explanation for what occurred here, and shows why the Russians also were not able to find an easy route into Chernihiv along the P56 highway. Therefore, we see that when the Russians made contact with the city of Chernihiv and found that it was defended, their first response was to try every other major route into the city to see if there's an easy way in. They discovered that the Ukrainians had defensive positions, demolished bridges, or both, covering every entrance to the city. In short, they'd organized a proper main defensive area. The Russians then made two moves on the main defensive area around Chernihiv. We'll start with the smaller one, which was a minor assault on the city in the southeast near the main airport. As we can see from this image, the Russians both assaulted the airport here and also attempted to move down this highway, but in both cases didn't get very far into the city. By the time the Russians arrived at Chernihiv, the airport had been fortified by National Guard troops. And in this image, I've emphasized the locations of their trench fortifications with green lines. The satellite imagery shows tank tracks from jockeying taking place on the west side of the airfield, and also signs that the Russians fought their way through this small village to the north in order to come right onto the outskirts of the airfield. It doesn't appear that the Russians were able to capture the airfield, and there's a lot of jockeying positions from Ukrainian tanks on the southeast and east side of the airfield. This matches reporting from a Ukrainian documentary on the Battle of Chernihiv, which claims the National Guard troops were reinforced on the second day that the Russians were attempting to seize the airfield by elements of the Ukrainian 1st Armored Brigade. From the number of tracks, the assault on the airfield appears to have been undertaken by an armored battalion tactical group. The first assault along the P-12 highway also appears to be about a battalion tactical group sized. The Ukrainians had a defensive position which was likely a little less than a company sized on this last high feature prior to a belt of forest and then the city itself starting. They also had about a company of infantry that was dug in on this hill, which has a dominating view of this outlying suburb called Novoselika. Therefore, when the Russians took this first offensive position along the highway, they would have come under withering fire from the hilltop positions. According to the Ukrainians, the Russians spent the first 2 weeks of March sending what they called special forces elements into Novoselika at night, taking advantage of their superior amounts of night vision equipment. That would be the way to avoid the withering fire from the hilltop defensive positions. However, given the lack of support from armored vehicles and tanks, it's not surprising that a light infantry force wasn't able to make much progress entering the city. There's very extensive shelling in this area, and it appears that the Russians were able to destroy this Ukrainian defensive position. There's then an awful lot of damage to the city in a box about 1 kilometer wide and 2 kilometers deep down the P-12 highway. After the first few hundred meters, there's no signs of any Russian tracks, so either the damage later in this orange area was from indirect fire like artillery, or whatever Russian forces were involved dismounted and fought on foot. In either case, they stopped, having gotten less than 2 kilometers into the city, which is less than a quarter of the way to the crucial highway and railway junctions in the city center. The main part of the main defensive battle for Chernihiv took place in the south, where the Russians attempted to encircle Chernihiv, but were only partially successful. After fighting their way to the outskirts of Chernihiv, the Russians attempted to bypass and encircle Chernihiv by flanking it along the east side. This involved a number of other encounter battles shown in this footage. The battles on this farthest south highway involve mostly Ukrainian infantry taking on Russian armor, in smaller numbers suggesting that this would have been National Guard actions as well. There were 2 company-level encounter battles, and then a battalion tactical assault on this fiber optic cable factory. It is difficult to tell which tracks were from the battle over the fiber optic cable factory, formerly an airport, and which occurred later, as in this satellite pass from March 22nd, we see several Russian armored vehicles as part of general patrols making tracks. The Ukrainians claim that the Russians suffered massive casualties at the fiber optic cable location, both during the assault on it and later from artillery and missile strikes by the Ukrainians. I do see a few clearly destroyed vehicles in the area, and a number that could be destroyed but more likely are just staging out of the location, so it doesn't appear the Russian losses were as large as reported in this area. For all 3 of these encounter battles, it appears the Ukrainians withdrew quite quickly and neither side suffered significant casualties. Shortly beyond the fiber optic cable, there's the only bridge outside of the city of Chernihiv across the Desna River. With the Russians not having been able to seize Chernihiv on the march, seizing this bridge was crucial to the second option, which was to encircle the city of Chernihiv. By the time the Russians arrived at the Dnesta River, the Ukrainians had already demolished the only bridge in the area that didn't go through the city center of Chernihiv. This proved to be quite a significant delay for the Russian advance, as the battles on the far side of the Dnesta River appear to have occurred around March 3rd. This was both predictable and exactly what the Ukrainians intended by demolishing that bridge. The Russian invasion largely occurred with their units organized into battalion tactical groups. That is, you have, in this example, a motor rifle regiment that has 3 motor rifle battalions of about 500 pers, and then a number of assets to support those battalions that are controlled by the regimental headquarters. This usually includes a tank battalion, an artillery battalion, armored reconnaissance company, anti-tank company, engineering company, and an air defense company. And you split them into thirds and give each of them to one of the motor rifle battalions. This maximizes the flexibility for the battalion tactical groups and allows them to have very quick reaction times to changing situations. However, if they encounter a task that can't be undertaken by them as a battalion tactical group, they need to halt and reorganize. In this case, the breaching of a water obstacle is a regimental level task. It requires a bridgehead battalion, a breakout battalion, and a reserve battalion. It also requires higher level engineering assets that are well beyond the scope of what the regiment has on hand. So they would likely need an engineering battalion brought up from the division level. And in order to be effective fighting as a regiment doing the river obstacle breach, all of the supporting units, like artillery, reconnaissance, anti-tank, need to be kept together as whole units under regimental control. This is also the point at which the Russian advance outstripped the 150-kilometer range of the MTO brigades, necessitating a move of the railhead supporting them. So it's not that surprising that after getting from the border to the outskirts of the city in one day, they weren't able to fight on the far banks of the Dniester River until about day 7 or 8, so almost a week later. Once the river was crossed, the bridgehead force secured a bridgehead perimeter by seizing Yadin on March 3rd and Yanivka on March 5th. And the breakout force then moved east to conduct an assault on Lukashvika. This battle took place on March 9th, so a little over 2 weeks into the war. In Yadin, mechanized Russian forces fought their way through the village while taking fire from Ukrainian armored forces, as you can see, from jockeying track marks to the north and east of the village. There was also a Ukrainian strongpoint to the northeast of the village here that received a lot of indirect fire, and then there are signs of the Ukrainians withdrawing to the east. While Yadin seemed to involve about a company, there appears to have been a battalion allocated to the assault on Ivanivka. Ukrainian armored forces jockeyed to provide support from this piece of high ground just north of Yadin, but they then withdrew. There's an absolute mess of overlapping Russian and Ukrainian tracks for Ivanivka itself, showing that there appears to have been a rather savage and close-range battle in this town, including a lot of indirect fire on a set of warehouses on the east end of town that the Ukrainians had strong-pointed. There's a high feature here to the east of the town that has the wrecks of 4 armored vehicles. It appears these are Ukrainian vehicles that were firing on the Russians in Yadin when they assaulted that town on March 3rd. The Ukrainians withdrew from Ivanivka through this open field, and it appears they did so while under fire from the Russians to their north here, though from a fairly small element such as a Russian armored platoon. The Ukrainians don't appear to have taken casualties during their withdrawal, likely because they were aided by a break-clean force that counterattacked south out of the village of Kloichevika. The Ukrainians claim the Russians then entered the village of Kloichevika, but were repulsed, and the satellite imagery does show at least 2 destroyed armored vehicles in front of a Ukrainian defensive position. A Russian armored company then advanced down this route into an area where they could direct fire onto the village of Lukashvika, though Ukrainian armored vehicles came out to exchange fire with them. This Russian armored company also acted as a fire base for an assault force made up of at least 2 companies that advanced north across this series of open fields towards Lukashvika. For the satellite imagery for the assault force, there are about a dozen destroyed armored vehicles evident. It appears that about a third of them are Ukrainian and 2/3 are Russian, but it's often quite difficult to tell. The tracks show the Russians entering Lukashvika and some fighting within it. However, they were unable to advance past the village. According to Ukrainian state TV, involved a Russian mechanized infantry regiment, though the track marks suggest it was a battalion tactical group, which is about 1/3 that size. Zooming out, I've added a yellow line for what the Wikipedia map says was the farthest extent of the Russians' advance. You may recall this is the map that I've found to be most accurate so far. It corresponds quite well to what I can see in the satellite imagery, though it does show the Russians pushing a bit further past Lukashvika than they actually did. It also correlates very well with where I calculated the maximum range of support from an MTO brigade, given the placement of the Russian railhead. Again, it's a bit further past Lukashvika than the tracks show the Russians actually advanced, though this was assuming the MTO brigade would be able to use the road through Kloichevika. With the Russians driven out of that village, they would have had to take a number of circuitous, mostly dirt roads around to the south that would have reduced their range. We can also see that the Russians came up 5 to 6 kilometers short of the final bridge and road out of Chernihiv, which the Ukrainians used to keep at least a trickle of supplies coming into the city for the remainder of the battle. It's agreed by both sides that Russian airstrikes and artillery strikes eventually did enough damage to the remaining Ukrainian-controlled bridges over the Desna River that heavy vehicles, such as trucks, could no longer cross. But Chernihiv was never encircled or completely cut off from supply. Therefore, according to the satellite imagery, the Battle of Chernihiv played out as follows. The Ukrainian 1st Tank Brigade fought a covering force battle against at least 4 battalion tactical groups. They were able to inflict casualties on the Russians and direct them away from the main M01 E95 highway, but were unsuccessful in delaying them significantly. When the Russians encountered resistance at the outskirts of Chernihiv, they probed every other major route into the city. At this point, the Russians had taken a fair number of vehicle casualties along the M01 highway from ambushes, but otherwise they hadn't engaged in any sustained combat. They weren't attempting to fight their way through prepared Ukrainian defensive positions. Maintaining a perimeter on the partially encircled city of Chernihiv would have required about 3 brigades of troops, though these could have been much lower quality units, or the Russian commander could have accepted risk by having a less strong force in place to contain Chernihiv. In the south, there was a pause of about a week, followed by a brigade-level assault river crossing of the Desna River. Once the bridgehead was secured, an exploitation force of about a battalion tactical group was sent into Lukashvika, but they were unable to push past the village, and therefore Chernihiv remained unencircled. In the north, about a battalion of light infantry pushed 1 to 2 kilometers into the city, but this advance was bogged down, and the Russians didn't reinforce the push. Therefore, the Russians were unable to encircle Chernihiv or to seize it on the march. They also were unable to seize both the rail routes through the city or the highway ring road, which would have at least allowed more efficient resupply by the MTO brigades out of a railhead located to the north of Chernihiv. Gone into a fair bit of detail about the Battle of Chernihiv for a couple of reasons. It's a good illustration of the issues the Russians would have had seizing these road and rail junction towns, and what happens when they're not able to seize it on the march, right at the outset of the conflict. Chernihiv was also probably the most important road and rail junction town, as having a railhead contained inside of Chernihiv would have allowed the MTO brigades to support a battle right into the heart of Kiev itself. Finally, it's a self-contained battle caught on satellite imagery that's openly available. There's an awful lot of satellite imagery and drone footage that we all see during this war, but what we don't tend to get is the broader picture. By giving you a battlefield tour of the Chernihiv region, I'm able to show you the entirety of a set-piece battle. This process dispelled a number of myths and misconceptions, or flat-out propaganda by both sides. Bear this in mind because we're now going to do another battlefield tour of a town called Kalynivka on the outskirts of Kiev, and there we'll find that there's an absolutely enormous gap between what we thought we knew from looking at drone clips online circulated by the media and from what becomes apparent when you can look at the broader picture through the satellite imagery. In the opening year of the war, this was the second most viewed video related to the Ukraine war on social media. It shows a Russian armored column along a highway coming under fire from Ukrainians inside the village of Kalynivka, which is just on the outskirts of Brovary. The video shows Russian tanks and armored vehicles being hit by guided anti-tank missiles, and then the Russians being forced to withdraw. This is part of that narrow poke at the Kiev defenses that the Russians conducted after they were unable to take the junction town of Nizhin. And the video was generally shared as an example of Russian incompetence. However, let's look at the broader picture. On the western bank of the Dnieper River, we've already discussed the main defensive area along the Irpin River. Looking at the satellite image of trench locations, we can see the Ukrainians also set up a main defensive area on the eastern bank of the Dnieper River, anchored on the Green Belt, the town of Brovary, and the Byorspel airport. Kalynivka was just inside this main defensive area belt of fortifications, and as part of the covering force battle, the Ukrainians had conducted various actions such as ambushes holding certain bits of ground, demolitions, and obstacles to shape the Russians into coming down this highway onto the first set of entrenchments and then towards Kalynivka. Along the highway at this town of Zalicia, there's an awful lot of artillery fire, and we can then see some tracks from both Russian and Ukrainian armored vehicles who were engaging with each other. Just to the right along the highway, there's a number of fortified houses and entrenchments by the Ukrainians. And from the pattern of tracks, it's apparent that the Ukrainians were defeated at this location, and the Russians continued to advance down the highway towards Kiev. There's then forest on one side and a small gap that's good canalizing terrain, where the Russians no doubt would have expected further ambushes and defensive positions. However, they pushed through this area without resistance. They likely then would have believed that they'd established a breakthrough of Kiev's main defensive area and would have rushed forward to exploit in depth. The video first shows the main Russian armored column about 2.5 kilometers from the outskirts of Kalynivka. It then pans to 3 tanks, which would either be an advance guard or a reconnaissance element, that are a kilometer outside of Kalynivka in a village called Skybin. The main body is then shown taking fire from the Ukrainians about 1.6 kilometers outside of Kalynivka. The Russians then withdraw, leaving behind a destroyed tank and a destroyed armored personnel carrier. But if we zoom out, we can see a very different story that's evidenced by this C shape of Ukrainian defensive positions. For this position, it's difficult to see because of the woods, but with close scrutiny, it's clearly a company defensive position. There's trenches for about a platoon here at the corner of the C. Here you see a trench that juts out quite a bit, but when you get closer in and look at the terrain, you see there's a rise in the ground that allows this T-shaped trench to have an excellent view across this open field. There are trenches across the high features all along here that are perpendicular to the highway, and then more entrenched positions on the other end of this C shape. So we have a forward position, but which the Russians capture fairly easily. But when the Russians try to exploit this potential breach of the main defensive area, they enter an area that is 4.5 kilometers wide and 3 kilometers deep, that's surrounded on 3 sides by Ukrainian defensive positions that have excellent fields of view or fields of fire across this entire C-shaped area. In military terminology, this is what's known as a kill zone. And given its size, 4.5 by 3 kilometers, with a frontage of 9 kilometers, this is a kill zone that is designed for a defending brigade to destroy a battalion tactical group. Going back to the video, we see that the main body has 13 tanks, along with another 3 tanks in the reconnaissance or advance guard. So in this image, we're seeing 2 armored companies and a mechanized infantry company. In the wider shot, you're able to see between 51 and 56 armored fighting vehicles, and a full-strength battalion tactical group tends to have about 65 armored fighting vehicles. Therefore, up to the point of the ambush, everything had gone according to Ukraine's plan. Russia had been shaped into coming down this highway. After fighting through Zalissa, they thought they had a breakthrough, and they became too aggressive in exploiting their apparent success. That's why there was initially only a 2-kilometer gap between the main body and the reconnaissance, and by the time the ambush was sprung, there's only 600 meters gap between them. Doctrinally, they should have something closer to 3 to 5 kilometers as a gap between the reconnaissance and the main body, precisely because it's the job of the reconnaissance to detect whether or not you've entered a kill zone. However, the results from this moment forward were quite disappointing for Ukraine. The main body was engaged too early. At 1.6 kilometers, it's within javelin range and the range of tanks. However, it's outside the effective range of the NLAW and the effective range of the cannons on infantry fighting vehicles. So only a small portion of the firepower from the defending Ukrainian brigade could be brought to bear on the main body. The Ukrainians also didn't, or couldn't, do anything to prevent the Russians from exiting the kill zone once they realized they were in it. Normally you would use a combination of obstacles, demolitions, counterattacking forces, and artillery to keep the Russians fixed inside of the kill zone where they could then have been destroyed. This type of kill zone requires a lot of time, planning, and effort, and the goal would have been to destroy the battalion tactical group. To do this, they'd need to destroy 20 to 24 Russian armored vehicles. So within that context, the Russians having escaped the kill zone, having lost 2 vehicles, is a very underwhelming outcome. However, without this broader context, the original video was widely shared as an example of a highly successful ambush on Russian forces. Two days later, the Russians sent another BTG down the same highway where they were ambushed at point-blank range by a Ukrainian light infantry anti-tank team. This video of that ambush was the 3rd most widely circulated video for the Ukraine war in its first year, and it does show the Russians lost at least 1 tank. However, the broader satellite imagery shows that the Russians then flanked to the left around the kill zone at Kalynivka, and then re-emerged on the outskirts of Brovary, where they engaged in fire with a few Ukrainian defensive positions. However, there's no sign of either significant losses or of the Russians pushing this attack home against determined resistance. Further south, we continue to see Ukrainian defensive positions, but we stop seeing any signs that the Russians made contact with them. Therefore, the Russian activity on the eastern side of Kiev appears to have been entering a kill zone with a single battalion tactical group, but then escaping having only taken 2 vehicle casualties, and then probing around the outskirts of Brovary with another battalion tactical group. Given the limited number of Russian forces assigned to this axis of advance, as well as the logistical problems of having not seized Chernihiv or Nizhyn, there's really not much else the Russians could have done on the eastern side of Kiev.
What did we learn, Palmer?
I don't know, sir.
In terms of tactical points, the first one is that this satellite imagery shows you how much you can craft pretty much any narrative you want, depending on which tactical engagement you show and what angle you show it from. With the caveat that I don't have all of the footage, the imagery coming out of the Chernobyl exclusion zone, the Battle of Anatov Airport, just didn't match up with the mainstream media portrayal of Russians incompetently driving down highways unsupported and getting slaughtered in ambushes. However, this does appear to be a fairly accurate description of the Russian advance on Chernihiv. This is likely because the advance through the Chernobyl exclusion zone was mostly opposed by improvised groupings of reserve and National Guard infantry. However, the covering force battle that took place on the road to Chernihiv was against Ukrainian regular force armored brigade. As a contrast, for the Battle of Kalynivka, the video that was shared widely on social media appears to show one of these roadside ambushes caused by Russian incompetence. However, with the satellite imagery showing a broader picture, we can see this was in fact a failed attempt to lure the Russians into a kill zone. The final tactical point has to do with the weakness of the Russians when it came to armored reconnaissance in these opening battles. Over the last 30 years, Russia has not placed a priority on developing armored reconnaissance vehicles. Their last dedicated armored reconnaissance vehicle, the BRDM-4, was developed in 1964. They use a number of more recently developed armored reconnaissance vehicles, like the BTR-80 and the BMP-2. However, these are infantry fighting vehicles that have had some modification for reconnaissance duties. What they have invested in over the last 10 years is what's better termed up-armored vehicles. These are Jeep-type vehicles that have been given bulletproof glass and had some armored plate bolted onto them. A good American equivalent would be the armored Humvees used by the reconnaissance troops in the HBO series Generation Kill. They initially purchased vehicles from Iveco in Italy and have since manufactured local versions called the Tiger and Vodnik. Now, one advantage in terms of analysis is that these Russian vehicles are unique to them. Unlike BTR-4s or BMP-3s, they're not used by the Ukrainians. This means that you can trust the numbers in open source vehicle loss tracking sites like Oryx a lot more than you can with vehicles shared by both sides. Looking at the Oryx numbers, for the first 30 days of the war, there are 45 armored reconnaissance type vehicles that are shown as destroyed, captured, or seriously damaged. However, more than a third of these are the BTR-80, which is predominantly used by the Russians for armored reconnaissance, but not exclusively. Given that not all of the lost vehicles would have been captured on social media, but most of them would, I think 45 is a pretty good ballpark number for understanding Russian armored reconnaissance vehicle losses in the first month of the war. Assuming the commonly understood order of battle for the Russian army for the first month of the war, these losses account to 8% of the reconnaissance-specific vehicles within tactical reconnaissance units. That's the reconnaissance units that would be used by battalion tactical group and brigade units, and 11% of the operational level reconnaissance units, which is the armored reconnaissance vehicles used by divisional and combined arms army reconnaissance units. These are very low losses for armored reconnaissance units in what was essentially an advance to contact mobile war in the first month. In this type of combat, armored reconnaissance typically takes enormous losses, usually the highest percentage losses of any of the combat arms. There's a joke within armored reconnaissance units, which I've been attached to a couple of times, that their job is to allow the commander to know where the enemy is by looking at the columns of smoke from the burning armored reconnaissance vehicles. The satellite images also seem to show that by and large, the advance guard of the Russian BTG columns isn't made out of armored reconnaissance vehicles, but out of tanks. This is a system that is employed sometimes, particularly where you are light on infantry, heavy on tanks, and are advancing deep into enemy territory with very exposed flanks. In those circumstances, the decision is sometimes made for the tanks to lead rather than armored reconnaissance, and for the armored reconnaissance units to be tasked with flank guard duties. As we mentioned in the earlier segment, tanks can do reconnaissance. However, it's not the most efficient use of them as an asset. In particular, what makes tanks effective in the reconnaissance role is their optics passage. A number of credible reports that I've seen indicate that this was a particular weakness of Russian tanks at the outbreak of the war, one that they've since largely rectified, and therefore you've seen their tank units be more effective. This would explain why the Russians often had issue with ambushes, and why their worst issue with this had to do with the road to Chernihiv, as that's where they were up against a formation that was ready for war on the first day. So with that, we've completed looking at the Battle of Kiev. There's of course still the question of what happened in the center and south of the country, as well as the push on Odessa. However, given that we're over 30 minutes at this point, that will have to wait for another day. But as a reminder, if you want to receive these episodes 1 to 2 weeks early, please join the paid tier within my Substack, and every second Substack post being for subscribers only. Many thanks, dear friends, and I'll speak to you later.